that. Can you see everything now on my screen? Does that look good? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
looks great.
Thank you. So we're really excited for this, and I see some familiar faces. Dr. Young is here, who was on our panel a couple of years ago. So my name is Gabe Serra. I'm the Associate Program Director at the UC San Francisco Anesthesia Residency. And I've been thankfully a part of BINGAP for many years now and spoken at a few conferences. Today we're going to chat about best practices for being an LGBT. There we go. Q, applicant for residency or fellowship. I'd like to thank my panelists for joining today. I'm going to actually have them introduce themselves. So Elaine, you want to go first?
Hi, I'm Elaine. I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the interns at our emergency medicine program at UCSF. And I have a guest. Oh, this is my cat Noodle. If you hear her meowing, it's because she wants to play.
Thank you, Elaine. And Reb, how about you? You mind going ahead?
Hi, everyone. My name is Reb Gonzalez. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I identify as genderqueer and trans, and I am in my first year of EM attending life in community emergency medicine in the East Bay, in California.
Great, thank you. And then Chase, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chase Anderson. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatry fellow at UCSF. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and excited to be with all of you.
Thank you, Chase. I texted Chase this morning and said, I don't know what to wear. Should I wear like UC branded stuff? And he said, I'm going to wear my most flowery Hawaiian shirt. And I'm glad that you did that. So thank you for that. We have no relevant financial relationships to discuss, and we're not discussing any use of medications today. We just have literally 2 more slides, and I wanted to just chat about 3 things. We're going to break this up. We really want to keep a lot of times for questions. I think one of the things that we've all chatted about in our preparation for this session is that this is an incredibly personal journey for many people, and your ability to disclose is variable. Your desire to disclose is variable. A lot of people feel that it depends on the specialty that you're applying to, et cetera. So we want to talk a little bit. We've broken this up into 3 things, kind of the application piece, the interview piece, and then the social media piece. And we have some on the right side, just some things that we want to address or some questions that have been brought up in the past. And then our goal is to really leave a lot of time for questions at the end. I'm glad to see we have a great number of participants here today. And then our last slide, we'll have some resources and then all of our email addresses, and everyone's agreed to connect with you via email if you have any questions. So for a few minutes, Reb's just going to talk about the application and a little bit about their journey and how to potentially address things on your application piece. So thank you, Reb, go ahead.
Hey, so I'd just like to share some thoughts and perspective on how you present yourself in the application, and just kind of upfront. So I felt like what came into my residency application process in a strong place, and that kind of gave me the option to decide what and how I wanted to disclose things. And so I think for all of us, we're just going to consider you have to consider how strong your application is and what field you're going into. I think it's okay to make choices as to what part of your story or your application you want to make more or less visible, because each of you deserves your best chance at an ideal match. So the first step is just taking time and reflecting on what that means for you. For some people, that might involve being very open about your gender or sexual identity. That was the case for me. In my residency application, I identified myself as genderqueer. At the time, I wasn't using they, them pronouns or identifying as trans. So my experience then was a little different from my experience now. But I was very upfront about being genderqueer, and that was an important part of my life and the work I'd done. And I think that actually served me well, because the field I was going into and the places I was applying to, that was seen as a plus. But I recognize that's not the case for everyone. If you can make a choice to be open, partly because one of the most important things to you might be being in a place where your sexual or gender identity are celebrated and very supported. But if your assessment is that you're a less competitive applicant, and you think your LGBTQ identity might be a liability, it is totally valid to shape your application according to that. And so thinking about how you write about the things you write about and how you talk about your life. But I guess I'd like you to also consider that when you think about your gender or sexual identity, that might be an asset in your application. And so also, even if you see yourself as less competitive, like give some space that might also be the case. I remember, so I went to SUNY Downstate, which is a medical school in Brooklyn, which, you know, is a woke coastal place, but everybody in my class, and this was just in, I graduated in 2016, was told not to disclose LGBTQ identity in your applications. And there were some of us who did, and there were some of us who didn't. But we, you know, have to figure that out for ourselves. And I guess when you think about preparing your application, if there are things you don't want to share or want to avoid getting into, just remember that everything you put on your application is open to questions. So what you put on there shapes what you're going to be asked about. But that doesn't mean you have to answer every question you're asked. So when you're shaping your application and deciding what to write, could be an important time to also prepare statements and pivots. So if you think about sharing, for example, like if you did a lot of work at a clinic for people living with HIV/AIDS that also was a primarily LGBTQ patient population, when you put that on your application, think about how you write about it, as that could be an opportunity to disclose things about your own identity, or you could focus more on like the HIV/AIDS aspect of it. I think that the most important thing is that you take some time and think about, take an assessment and maybe get some input from other people about how strong your application is, the field you're going into or applying to, or fields, depending on your application, and kind of where you stand and what your options are.
Thank you, Reb. I think the theme we're going to see throughout this whole talk is it's very personal, right? The decisions that we make. I'm surprised to hear that your school gave that advice kind of globally, though, which is pretty interesting. Elaine, you want to go ahead and chat about kind of the interview and some of the experiences that you had or you've heard of experiences people have had?
Sure. So just a little background. So I identify as a cis queer woman, and I was kind of going into the application season thinking, so things that are really important to me aside from applying into emergency medicine were things like my other identities. So also identifying as like an immigrant and Asian American, and coming from kind of like the first gen low income community, and thinking about how to get across or ask about all of these things in an interview, and convey that they were all important to me. And then other things like my involvement with LGBTQ health research, and mentorship. I wanted to like ask about all of these things, and I decided that I was at a point where I could be out. And so my application was activity wise like pretty queer. It was a big part of what I was doing in med school. And then I also disclosed my identities in my personal statement. But I wanted to hopefully share a couple tips that are could be useful no matter kind of like where you are, and like how much you'd like to share, because I think you can still ask about a lot of these things without having to make yourself be vulnerable and say anything about yourself. And in general, something I found really helpful during the interview season was before every interview coming up with questions tailored to what kind of role I was talking to. So like the questions you ask a resident might not be the same as those you ask a program director. Like I didn't think it would be as helpful to ask a program director like the day-to-day, like, oh, like how many queer hangs do the residents do? I would prepare a couple things for every interview, and they were not all queer related, but in terms of like questions that you might be asked, I just wanted to put out there because there's a chance you might get asked inappropriate questions, whether or not that's related to your sexual orientation, gender identity, or other identities you have. And I think just because you come out in your personal statement doesn't mean people have a free license to kind of like probe into your identities, whether that's like your coming out story or if you transitioned and that kind of all that stuff. And I would say I've had like personal experiences where when I was applying to med school, I had said I was queer, but I didn't talk about really anything else related to my personal journey. And I was asked like inappropriate questions about my coming out process, and I had not come out to my parents. And it was actually a very traumatizing interview. Luckily, didn't happen in residency. But I would say like whatever you put in your application is fair game, but just know that it doesn't mean they can ask you everything. So if you just, even if you subtly hint like, oh, I identify as this, and then you move on in your essay, you might find that interviewers will pick up on that and want to ask you more. But don't feel like you have to talk about anything that makes you uncomfortable. You can decline it. You can just flat out lie and move on to protect yourself. But if you're excited to talk about it and excited to link it to some of your questions, I would say it can be really helpful to come up with specific questions related to being LGBTQ or doing work in the community. And one general tip is I found that me asking people like, oh, just can you tell me like anything about LGBTQ stuff here was not very helpful, because people would be like, oh, like, what do you mean? And I was like, I realized that was a bad question, but I kind of just wanted to hear everything. And so over the course of my interview season, I would come up with questions like, oh, can you tell me about the LGBTQ representation in your program, like at the resident level? What about your faculty? Do you think I'd be able to find mentors? And how I worded it differed from place to place, depending on whether or not I had the feeling that there were queer faculty. But that was helpful because then they would often bring up specific faculty who were doing work that I was interested in, and could link us up with residents as well to talk more. And since I do some queer health research, I also asked, are there people here doing either like social EM or population health, LGBTQ specific research? And if not, how could I get support working on the residency? And then something else that was very important to me was we all have like conference time in our residencies, like no matter what specialty you do, and everyone does it a different way. And for our program here, we have a half day every week that's dedicated, small group lectures, etc. So some questions I asked were, are there dedicated conference hours or times in teaching LGBTQ health, like regardless of specialty, and how do you feel like the curriculum is improving for queer patients? And then one question I also really like to ask residents was how involved they were in residency recruitment, because I think it's really important for residents to have a say in kind of like shaping future classes of residents, and advocating for people who are underrepresented or aren't traditionally kind of like welcomed into our careers and our groups. And I feel very fortunate because at our program we are encouraged to be involved and to chat with students and kind of like share our opinions as well.
Thank you, Elaine. I love the comments that you brought up. It really is important to ask questions about how you're going to feel supported, how you're going to fit into the community of your program. I don't know, by nature of me being, sorry, you see IT tech things. By nature of me being the program director, we have a special mentorship program for our LGBTQ plus residents where they're paired up with a faculty member. We have a resident who identifies as non-binary, and we have no faculty that identify that way. So I was able to find them a mentor on campus in another department. So, so there are a lot of things. We have a dedicated LGBTQ plus curriculum for our residents to learn about how to treat patients that are sexual and gender minorities. So I think there's a way to look at figuring out and using those questions that Elaine brought up to figure out how much is this a priority to the program that you're applying to, no matter what specialty that it is, because even in anesthesia, something that's not necessarily considered to be something that's a place that's super friendly to queer applicants. Clearly, there are programs that are making changes and doing things like that, and some that aren't. So we have our famous Twitter, our famous tweeter. Chase has a very large Twitter presence and tweets often. And we really wanted to put this in here because I 1000% want everyone to know that program directors will look you up on social media. It is very common. I don't know if Med Bikini crossed any of your paths this past year. Like that was a big thing related to the vascular surgery article about professionalism. They did a whole study on this, which it was total garbage, but I think that people are looking at it and something to think about. I think Chase will offer some interesting perspective. I think he's going to talk about how he used a different name, I believe. I'll leave it up to him, but Chase, go ahead.
Hi, nice to be with all of you. So I think I want to say, first of all, like I'm a psychiatrist by training, so everything has nuance to it. So anything I tell you, like make sure that it fits to you and it feels comfortable to you, because we all live with the decisions that we make and things like that. And so just want to make sure that whatever I tell you, there are going to be caveats to it. Sorry, I think I'm going through puberty right now. So I think to go back a little bit, I'm not that much older than the new applicants, but actually things were different during my time. When I first applied to med school, I remember that my uncle who did admissions for UCLA for med school actually was like, we do very much look at accounts and we like go through pictures and things like that. So I changed my name on Facebook at the time. This was in like 2013. Changed my name, like made sure my account couldn't be found and things like that, and that was private. And then did the same thing for residency applications again 4 years later, so 2017. And then when I applied to fellowship, I left my account completely as myself. And I was just like, oh, well, like they're gonna see who I am. And like I have colored hair now, like they're either gonna like this or not. But that was a very personal decision. And I had progressed and developed over time where I felt more comfortable doing that. I think the culture has changed somewhat, so I want to point that out. I have some friends who are very active on Twitter as well and known for being like social justice advocates. And a couple of them actually got interviews because people had seen their Twitter account. So I want to say that times are changing in some ways, and people are saying like, oh, how you present yourself. And if you're like a social justice advocate, oh, you talk about like HIV research, you do this. That's really fascinating to some program directors. But I will always want to take a step back and think about how can things come across? How can things be perceived, not only by program leadership, but also just the general public? And because you are going to be a resident or a person who works at that university, how do you represent that university that you might be applying to? And how will things look when they like are presented to people? So I think from my own story in terms of my account for Twitter, I actually started a Twitter account under a pseudonym. It was Casey Artem back in the day. I did that in 2019. The reason I did it under a pseudonym was because I had already experienced a lot of blowback from my university where I was for residency. And I was very scared to speak up about things. And I had spoken up about race and diversity, but it didn't go well. Changes were made and things got better, but it was really difficult during that time. And I was actually pretty depressed because of things that had happened. And so Jack Turbin, who's also very active on Twitter, we went to residency together and he was like, Twitter's a way for you to pop off and talk about things. And I was like, oh, but what if I get found out and like I'm applying to fellowship? So we made a pseudonym. So it's just something to think about, like, do you want to speak up in a way that's safe for you? And what does safety look like for you when you do speak up? Got into UCSF and then came here and I saw that a lot of professors and a lot of students were very vocal. was part of the reason I had chosen this university. And then I unveiled myself or revealed myself on Twitter. So that was my own personal journey, though. I think when thinking about doing your social media accounts now, when you are applying, think about like, how do I present myself? If you are somebody who is like, I post like shirtless pictures sometimes now, and like everybody at UCSF is like, that's great. Like, we love body positivity. I would not have gotten away with that in residency. So think about the context that you're in, and then also stay true to yourself. If you're doing social media and it's to get attention or like to do other things, then make sure that you really think hard about like, how do I want to present myself? How do I want to be the person that I am? And I think the other thing with social media accounts is trying to stay true to yourself. Um, I think everybody knows very much on Twitter, I like try to stay true to myself and like I will speak up about things, but that's my way of doing advocacy and that's my way of doing things. Figure out the way that works best for you to speak up like using your social media. And the other thing is also thinking about one of the things I did look at too, actually, was were there other professors who were using social media when I was applying to fellowship? Like, what universities had professors who were speaking up about issues? How were they speaking up about them? So it actually made it so UCSF seemed like a very safe place for me to do so. Those are some big things that I try to think about, but I think the main message is try to stay true to yourself. And if you want to close your account down because it feels more comfortable, then that is fine. But if you want to leave it open, just think about the image that's being portrayed and how that can come across. I can dive more into any of that if anybody wants me to.
Thanks, Jason. Nancy brought up a great comment in the chat, which is considering that you might not want to go somewhere that doesn't accept you for who you are, right? And that's ties into the nuanced comments that people have been making about how this isn't just a one-way street. This really goes both ways. And so you want to learn a lot about a place, and if your Twitter or your existence is offensive to somebody, maybe that's a sign that that's not a good place for you to be. We did talk about that on our kind of like pre-panel discussion when the four of us got together, five of us with Nelson. And one of the things that did come up though in response to that was some people don't necessarily have that luxury of like cutting out a bunch of programs. If you're applying to an incredibly competitive specialty, you may not have the luxury of cutting out a program. Or if you are not an especially competitive applicant, or you don't come from an incredibly competitive school. Obviously, unfortunately, there's a lot of layers to this whole process. And some people may not have the advantages that others do. And so that's something that we talked about, but I like Nancy's point. There are a couple of questions. I'm gonna just start from the beginning. Where'd it go? The first one for Reb or anyone else. Have you ever heard from anyone in your class or someone that you know who matched into a program and later regretted not disclosing their identity?
You know, I've heard more of people who, like, the minute they got there, they're like, and I'm gay. And then in general, we're really well accepted. I haven't heard, and sometimes I think people felt like they matched because they kind of shielded their identity, which I don't know that was always the case. But I think in the application process, maybe they felt that way. I have not heard of that. Maybe someone else has.
And scrolling through, do you think that a Twitter account dedicated to medicine-related context looks good or offers an advantage? Personally, as a program director, I don't know that it would offer you an advantage, or that the lack of one would put you at a disadvantage. Meaning, I don't think you should go start a Twitter account if you think it's going to help you get into residency. So I think that's why I wanted to put that. Yes, it can help you. There was an applicant this year who matched into our program who I came to know very well on Twitter. And actually that I think was an affinity for me toward him, and definitely helped him match in our program. But I don't think that you need to create one to put yourself at a quote unquote advantage. I don't think that there's a necessity for that. If you like it, like, Chase said, Twitter is a place that serves a purpose for many people for many different things. Instagram is the same. I have a private Instagram account that is purely personal and for my friends and my family and for me. And then I have a professional Twitter account that is entirely professional. So I think that you just need to decide what if it's something you're interested in and want to do. My husband hates Twitter and does not have a Twitter account. And so, I wouldn't say go create one just to get into residency. I don't think that that's a necessity. What other questions? You can ask them in person if you want to raise your hand, or if you want to type them in the chat. Happy to answer questions.
I'll just say, oh, sorry. Who is?
I
Go
was
ahead.
ask Gabe or anyone that's interacted with surgeons or surgery departments or programs that are traditionally considered more conservative. If there are any anecdotes you want to share about those programs or colleagues, any advice or stories about LGBTQ people in more conservative fields and advice for applicants.
I have some, but anyone on the panel want to dive in? No? Okay. I would love to say that, and there's some comments that I'm seeing in the chat, again, going back to if you can't be yourself, this is not a good place for you. I agree with that. I think one of the problems that I've encountered with, we know that racism exists in medicine, right? We know that homophobia exists and transphobia exists in medicine too. So I think it's a challenging way for us to navigate space and say, I don't think you should apply to surgery or orthopedic surgery or anesthesiology, specialties where like 60 to 70% of the population of practitioners identify as conservative or Republicans. I don't think that I want to start this process of saying that there's no space for queer people in those fields, because clearly there is. I also think that academia in general is a more liberal, progressive, and accepting place, and that's where you tend to be training, obviously, in academic centers. I think it runs the gamut. I have had friends who have not felt comfortable at all and have entirely hidden their identity. And then there was so I trained at the University of Miami. There was an orthopedic surgery resident who went through the entire match process closeted as a gay man, and then tried to come out during residency and had an incredibly negative response and reaction from his co-residents and his program leadership, and then actually ended up leaving the program. And then I've had friends and known people who have come in as their true self and had an incredibly welcoming experience by program leadership, potentially even been highly recruited to increase kind of the diversity of their program and to just say, we would like someone like you to change what our program looks like. So I do think that it runs the gamut. I think a lot of this, as with everything in medicine, goes back to mentorship and sponsorship and utilizing programs like BINGAP and other programs that you may be